Hello, and today we're going to be reviewing the Ryobi RY40701 40V 8-inch earth auger. So let's get started. And starting off, we have the 40V battery slot. The 40V battery slot will house any of Ryobi's 40V batteries, and overall it does its job just fine. I will say it doesn't feel overly robust, and it doesn't have the smoothest slide, but it works, and I don't see any major issues with its location, so it gets a pass. And next up we have the LED indicator. Green means that it's running, red means an overload or a fault has occurred, which means the tool has stopped working, and blue means a kickback has been prevented. So overall, this is a very useful feature, and I'm glad that they included it, so it gets a pass. And next up we have the hand grips. Now the hand grips on this particular tool are functional and they do their job, but they're just not comfortable. They don't have any rubberized texture, and they're just not that high quality feeling. I haven't had any issues with them, and they do their job, but I really would have preferred a rubberized coating and maybe just a little bit better just grip design. But like I said, they're functional and they do their job, but I would highly recommend wearing gloves when using this particular tool. And considering the price of the tool, I think Ryobi could have did better. And next up we have the padded brace. Now the padded brace is useful for when you're drilling into the ground, and it definitely is a welcome feature because otherwise you'd be having your leg against the hard metal. So overall I am glad they included it. Now in the promotional pictures they show a padded brace on both sides, and well, mine just doesn't have that. Only one side has the padded brace, and while looking through the promotional pictures I noticed that one of the tools in the promotional picture also only had it on one side. So I think this is just something that they decided to maybe cut back or save costs or something. I really wish they would actually use pictures of the tools that they're selling when they're doing this, just simply because, well, it is a little bit misleading, and as far as I'm concerned, it's a little bit of a scumming marketing tactic. So at the end of the day, I'm glad that it has it on the useful side for when you're going into the ground, but it still would have been nice to have it on the other side for when you're using the tool in reverse. So yeah, moving on. And next up we have the mode selector switch. The mode selector switch has 3 different positions, marked high, low, and reverse, and overall it does its job just fine, although I personally would have liked it to be a little bit bigger just to make it easier to work with for when you're wearing gloves. Now when the tool is in the low setting, this is probably the setting you're going to be using most of the time, and it works fairly well in this setting. The high setting is definitely faster, and it makes the tool a little bit harder to control, but overall it's still not impossible, and it will help you finish the job quicker. And last but not least, we have the reverse setting for when you need to extract the tool from the project that you're currently working with. So overall the switch is perfectly functional, although it is on the small side, and I personally would have liked it to be bigger, but it gets a pass. And next up we have the trigger. Now the trigger is a combination trigger and slash safety, and overall it works just fine. I haven't had any issues with it. The trigger response time is fairly quick, and it is fairly easy to operate when using gloves. So the trigger I think is just fine. It is a single speed trigger, that's why you need the speed selector switch, and I think that's a perfectly fine design for this particular tool. Now the response time from when you pull the trigger until the auger starts to rotate is fairly quick, but you will have to wait a second after you pull the trigger for the motor to get up to full speed before you can start digging. But overall that's fairly typical for a tool like this. So yeah, it gets a pass. Next up we have the connection point in between the controls and the motor. Once you assemble the tool and screw these 2 connectors together, you really won't have to worry about anything in the future or having to deal with this in the future. So yeah, moving on. And next up we have the quick connect point for the auger bit. Now the quick connect point on this particular auger is an 8mm quick connect, although I personally would suspect that maybe a 3/4 inch connector would also work, although I've not been able to test this out personally, so proceed at your own risk if you decide to get a third-party adapter or bit. Now overall the connection point appears to be fairly robust, and I haven't had any major issues after digging 30-some holes with this particular auger, so I'm perfectly satisfied with how well it's holding up so far. And next up we have the Auger Bit. Now the Auger Bit is an 8-inch auger with a drilling depth of up to 32 inches, and overall it's worked just fine. It's not a top-of-the-line auger bit, and it's also not a bargain basement auger bit either. It's probably about middle of the pack when it comes to the quality. The paint has started to wear off on my particular auger bit, and the teeth have started to dull, although I might have been responsible for some of that because of the videos that I'm showing. Now, I will say that this particular auger bit works fairly well on hard, dry ground that's not frozen, and it works great on softer ground or even just slightly frozen ground. But if you are trying to dig into frozen ground, this auger just will not do the job. You're probably going to have to use something attached to a tractor if you're going to deal with frozen ground, because quite frankly, this particular tool just doesn't have the horsepower or just the weight that's needed for dealing with frozen ground. Now, when it comes to drilling holes into hard or dry ground, this tool does a fairly decent job. I was able to drill several holes into some ground that had not been exposed to any sort of moisture for a couple of months, and I was able to complete it far faster than what you would be able to do with a manual pair of postal diggers. I did have to soak a couple of holes in order to finish the drilling job completely, and that isn't ideal, but it's still way better than a manual pair of postal diggers if you've ever had to use a manual pair of postal diggers. So at the end of the day, I'm still fairly happy with its performance on ground that has not been exposed to any sort of moisture for a couple of months. So it gets a pass here as well. Now, if you're dealing with ground that has lots and lots of large rocks, this tool is not going to be good, and it's just not going to get the job done. The anti-kickback feature will engage too often, and that's just the nature of the beast when it comes to this electric postal digger. And if you're dealing with ground that has lots of roots, that's also going to be problematic as well, especially if they're larger size roots. So rocky ground, high rooted ground, it just isn't a good tool for that particular scenario. But for ground that is harder or for ground that is soft, this is a good auger. I would recommend using this auger probably in the springtime and early summer. Late summer you can use it as well. You might have to soak a couple of your holes in order to finish the job completely, but it's still perfectly functional. I wouldn't recommend using this auger in the winter time, especially on frozen ground, because it just doesn't have the horsepower or weight that's needed in order to get through frozen ground, and it just isn't designed for that particular sort of a job. But for most of the time, or most of the year, I've been fairly happy with just the overall performance of this auger, and I've used it in the summer, I've used it in the fall, and I've used it in the winter, and now I've used it in the spring. So overall, it's been perfectly adequate for my particular needs, and I really do think that it's worth the price that they're asking for it, especially considering there aren't a whole lot of options on the market for an electric auger. And, well, gas-powered augers that are hand-operated are cheaper, but they're a whole lot more of a hassle to have to work with, because once you get started drilling in and turning it on, turning it off, having to get gas, prepping it for winter, having to deal with gaskets, you know, there's just so much more work that goes into using a gas-powered auger. Even if it is cheaper, I just don't think it's really worth the added hassle, at least not when it comes to a hand-operated gas auger. Now, with that being said, if I had a tractor-mounted auger or a bobcat-mounted auger, that would definitely be the superior way of going, but I can't afford either one of those options, so this is the best option that I personally have. So, at the end of the day, I really do enjoy having this particular auger because it makes a lot of projects that would normally take 3 or 4 hours into only an hour or so project. So it definitely saves me quite a bit of time, and in my opinion, that's definitely worth the price. So, yeah, let's move on to the pros and cons. And the first pro would be good torque. Overall, the torque on this particular auger is, well, it's pretty good. I was pretty impressed, and it had more than what I was expecting. So at the end of the day, I would consider this to be a pro. Quiet. Compared to a gas-powered auger, this is a very quiet tool, and overall, this is very useful for when you're digging those holes at 3 a.m. in the morning. So a pro in my opinion. 8-inch auger bit. Overall, the 8-inch auger bit is plenty big enough to handle pretty much any sort of fence post the average homeowner or ranch owner might come across. So in my opinion, this is a pro. Anti-kickback system. The anti-kickback system is definitely a useful feature and will definitely help protect your arms from those unexpected lurches or if it gets away from you when you're digging a hole. So even if it is a little bit annoying sometimes, it is a useful feature and definitely a pro in my opinion. Brushless. This unit features a brushless motor, and that definitely helps supply the amount of torque that you need for digging holes into hard ground. So in my opinion, this is a pro. Forward and reverse. Overall, having the ability to choose in between 2 different speeds is definitely useful, and having a reverse is definitely super useful because we've all been in those situations where you've accidentally dug too deep and the only way to get the tool out is to, well, throw it into reverse. So pro in my opinion. And the first man would be the price. Now the price on this particular tool only is $320, and with a battery it's $350. So obviously the better option is to get it with the battery. Now $350 is a little bit on the expensive side. That's about $150 more than a cheap budget auger that's gas powered. I think the convenience is definitely worth it, not to mention just the safety features that this offers that gas versions don't offer, and the fact you don't have to worry about gasoline. But at the end of the day, $350 is still a lot of money. But then again, the way inflation's going, that might be a bargain, and considering that a couple months from now, it could cost anywhere from $500 to $600. So this is definitely a tool I would buy sooner than later, just because of the way the world is going at the moment. Battery life. Overall, the battery life with this particular tool is fairly good. If you're dealing with soft ground, you can usually dig over 10 holes easily with a 4 amp hour battery. If you're dealing with super hard ground, you're probably going to be lucky to be able to finish 3 holes. So at the end of the day, the battery life is hard to determine, but I still think it's fairly decent, especially considering just how much torque this particular tool has. And the first con is no rubberized coating. There is no rubberized coating anywhere on this particular tool, and that means that it's going to be uncomfortable to hold barehanded, and it's going to get scratched up easily. So overall, I would definitely consider this to be a con. And considering the price, this is unacceptable, and they really should have included some rubberized texture, at least on the grips. I briefly mentioned it before with the rubberized coating, but this tool scratches incredibly easy on the plastic or on the metal. Overall, I really would have preferred to have a little bit better quality plastic that doesn't scratch as easily, or maybe a little bit better texturized surface to the plastic. So overall, I would definitely consider this to be a con as well. Size. This isn't something that is very easily controlled, but this is a very large tool, and overall it makes it a little bit difficult to transport around. It's not impossible, and being electric definitely makes it an easier to tool, or safer at least, to transport around, but at the end of the day, it's still a large tool and a little bit of a con in my opinion. Rusts easily. Definitely something that you need to keep in mind when you use this tool. Once the paint wears off, you probably need to recoat it, or at least clean the dirt off after every use. Simply because otherwise you're going to be dealing with a rusty tool, and nobody likes a rusty tool. And that is it for the pros and cons. Final thoughts on this particular tool. This tool comes in handy for a variety of different situations, everything from installing fences to digging drainage holes. I'm really glad I ended up getting this tool, and it's come in handy. Although I still am not too crazy about the price that they're asking for it. But at the end of the day, I think it's way easier to work with than a gas-powered hand auger. And it's definitely way superior to a manual auger, unless you don't have any batteries. But for me personally, I'm glad I got it, and it definitely comes recommended. I think most people will be happy with it once they get it. Just keep in mind, though, that this is not a good auger for, well, drilling into frozen ground. I really think that you need to have a semi-moist ground, or at least dry, unfrozen ground for this auger to be effective. But as long as you keep that in mind, this auger comes highly recommended. And that's it for this video. If you liked it, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. God bless.